There's a town in eastern Missouri called Bonne Terre. The name is French. It means good earth. You could drive through the whole place in about 3 minutes. A gas station, a few churches, a quiet main street, the kind of small town you'd forget before you reach the next one. But under your tires, 300 feet straight down, there is a city. Not a metaphor, an actual city of stone. Vaulted halls held up by pillars 5 stories tall, more than 250 miles of railroad track, streets and rooms and stairways carved by hand out of solid rock. And today, most of it is underwater. 1 billion gallons of it. The largest underground lake on the planet sits directly beneath that sleepy main street, and almost nobody driving past has any idea it's there. This is the story of how a handful of men turned good earth into an underground empire. How the towns of Bonne Terre, Desloge, Park Hills, and Leadington were all born from the same hole in the ground, and what's waiting down there now that everyone's gone home. Let's start with the rock, because everything here begins with the rock. The lead under this part of Missouri had been known for 150 years before anyone got serious about it. French colonial miners had scratched at it since the 1700s, digging shallow pits by hand, hauling up chunks of galena, lead ore, with shovels and mule carts. It was good earth, all right, but the real fortune wasn't the dirt. It was what sat underneath it. Then, on March 25, 1864, 6 men in New York City signed the papers for a company called the St. Joseph Lead Company. They bought up about 946 acres around Bonne Terre, and they started to dig. Not a pit this time, but a shaft, straight down into the dark, following the ore by candlelight. That shaft became the first mine of what would be called the Old Lead Belt, and for the next century, it would barely ever stop. But there was a problem. In those early years, mining was guesswork. You dug and you hoped. You could sink a shaft for months chasing a vein of ore and come up with nothing but broken rock. The men were digging blind. And here's where it gets fascinating. The mine's manager, a man named Charles Parsons, read a short article in a magazine about a strange new invention, something called a diamond drill. The idea sounded almost like science fiction, a hollow drill bit, its cutting rim set with real black diamonds that could bore straight down through hundreds of feet of bedrock and pull up a continuous core of solid stone. A slender cylinder of rock about an inch thick that you could lay out on a table and read like the rings of a tree. On March 5, 1869, that drill arrived at Bonne Terre, hauled in along with a man named Albert Shepard, who'd run one before at a quarry back in Peekskill, New York. They set it up near one of the inclines and started the very first hole. It bored down 90 feet and came up showing only a few specks of ore. A disappointment. But it didn't matter, because for the first time in the history of lead mining, men could see underground before they dug. The diamond drill could reach down 500 feet and bring the answer back up in a stone core. Bonne Terre was the first lead mine on Earth to use one. And once you can find the ore before you move a single ton of rock, everything changes. The mine exploded outward. Over the decades, it spread underground like a root system, 200 to 300 feet deep, room after room hollowed out and held up by enormous pillars of rock left standing on purpose like columns in a cathedral. They laid more than 250 miles of railroad track down there in the dark. At first, real mules lived and worked underground, some of them for years without ever seeing the sun. Later, the mules were replaced by squat little electric locomotives the miners called electric mules. And up on the surface, the St. Joe Company built a processing plant called Federal Mill No. 3 that became, for a time, the largest lead mill in the entire world. And every one of these towns grew out of that same operation. Take Desloge, just up the road. It's named after Firmin Desloge, a man whose family had come from France generations earlier and never stopped chasing lead. In 1887, he cleared the land and built rows of company houses for his workers in a spot they just called Desloge Town. He sank his own shaft, built his own mill, and by 1892, it was running. The town is the mine. They're the same thing. Or Leadington, and you don't get a more honest name than that. It was laid out in 1895, right after mining started on the site, built by the lead company as housing for its workers. The town was named, plainly, after the metal coming out of the ground beneath it. Or the cluster of little mining camps, Flat River, Elvins, Esther, that grew up so close together they eventually just merged. In 1994, they combined into a single city and called it Park Hills. And then there's Farmington, the older county seat nearby, the town that fed and supplied and buried the miners, the place that kept the whole machine running. These weren't towns that happened to have a mine, they were mines that grew towns. The lead came first, the people came for the lead. And St. Joe didn't just dig the mines. It built the houses, the stores, the ball fields, whole towns laid out around a company paycheck. For a century, in town after town, the lead company was the landlord, the employer, and the entire reason you were there at all. And the numbers are almost hard to believe. From 1864 to 1972, the old lead belt pulled roughly 8.5 million tons of lead out of the ground. At its peak, this one stretch of Missouri was producing as much as 80% of all the lead mined in the United States. The bullets, the pipes, the paint, the batteries, for the better part of a century, a huge share of it started here, 300 feet under these quiet little towns. But here's the thing about ore, it runs out. By 1962, the lead at Bonne Terre was finally giving out and the mine shut down. By 1972, the whole old lead belt had gone silent. The men went home, the lights went off. But they left the land changed forever. All that rock they'd hauled up and crushed had to go somewhere, and it ended up in enormous piles of pale, sandy grit the miners called chat. Mountains of it spread for miles across the countryside. Today, a big stretch of that ground is a state park. There are 800 acres of sand flats on the south edge of Park Hills, and on a summer weekend, you'll find whole families out there on ATVs and dirt bikes, kicking up dust, riding back and forth across the ground-up bones of the ore that built every town for miles. The old Federal Mill stands close by too, the one that was once the largest lead mill in the world, preserved now as a museum you can walk straight through. That's what they left on the surface, but the strangest thing they left was underground, because as the last of the mines closed, someone finally did the one thing that had held the water back the entire time. They turned off the pumps. Because all those years the mine had been fighting groundwater, pumps ran day and night around the clock just to keep the lower levels dry enough to work. The moment those pumps stopped, the water began to rise. Slowly, silently, it crept up through the carved stone halls and filled the bottom of the mine. And it kept filling until the lower levels held 1 billion gallons of water. 17 miles of flooded passageways, in places 375 feet deep. And because it's groundwater filtered through solid rock, it's astonishingly clear. Divers down there can see more than 100 feet in front of them, drifting between pillars and along old railways like ghosts over a sunken city. In 1983, the ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau, a man who had dived everywhere on Earth, came to this little town in Missouri and went down into the flooded mine. He said he had never seen anything like it. National Geographic would later name it one of the 10 greatest adventures in America. People now fly in from all over the world to scuba dive a hole that men dug for lead in a town most of the country has never heard of. So the next time you find yourself driving through Bonne Terre, Missouri, past the gas station, past the church, In and out in about 3 minutes. Remember what's underneath you. A hand-carved stone city, 300 feet down, its halls flooded with 1 billion gallons of impossibly clear water, holding its breath in the dark. They called it good earth. They were only ever looking for lead, and the ground gave them something nobody thought to dig for.